Well, Steve, shall we get the ball rolling?
I'm ready when you are.
Fantastic. Let's get going. Once again, it's great seeing you as we mentioned in our conversation prior. We were here the last time, probably just at the beginning of the summer or mid-July, somewhere abouts. And the autumn is now upon us. It's good seeing you again. And today we will be talking about stitching small text for embroidery. We're going to get some tips and tricks from you as ever. But I think what I want you to do for those in our audience who haven't met you before, just give a little overview of what you do at QDigitizing, beyond being the managing partner. Talk about your how long have you been in the industry and your areas of expertise?
Wow. Okay. So
In
I
a
start,
nutshell, Steve, in a nutshell.
so I started out in 1988. So I'm 30 plus years now in the commercial embroidery industry. I'm a self-taught digitizer. Um, I'm I consider myself an expert, although I hate to say that, in Melco software. I'm also highly skilled in Wilcom and Pulse, but I'm actually a beta tester for Melco software. I've known it for 30 years, so that's kind of my thing. I've
Good.
also managed an embroidery floor that had more than 1,100 embroidery heads and processing well over 4 million pieces of apparel a year. And that's
Oh my word.
everything from hats to socks and everything in between.
Good man. So I think you have a fair bit of experience, if if I may say so, in this area. So let's crack on and let's talk about some of the challenges. So tell me, why is it exactly that small texts in particular are so challenging within the embroidery digitizing industry?
Give me just 1 second here. I'm sorry, I goofed up there technically.
I can see your screen.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. I clicked the wrong button by accident, folks. Okay, so um, so the biggest problem that you encounter with small text is, unlike complex embroidery designs like the Hooligans logo that you see on the left side of your screen,
Yeah.
if a couple stitches are out of place, you'll never know it because the design is so complex and so busy that a couple of stitches here and there that aren't perfect aren't going to matter. But when it comes to small text, if even one stitch or two stitches is out of place, everybody knows what those letters look like. So when they don't look good, they don't look good. And there's no way to hide it. You can't
Full
bury
stop.
it. So
So you're saying that the fact that it is so visible, you've got to be extra careful. Now, I suppose from my perspective, when you talk about digitizing, texts are already small. So what in terms of size definition, what's our definition of small text when it comes to embroidery digitizing?
so there's from an industry standpoint, it's generally accepted that any text that is 1/4 inch or smaller, which is about 4 millimeters, is considered to be small text. But the important thing that there is to remember is, and we're going to discuss this a little bit further as we get further into the webinar, the size of the text, as far as the height or the width of the letter goes, is not really the single most controlling factor. The most important thing is how wide are the column stitches that are in that letter. And as we move along, we'll talk about that in the next few slides. But here's the most important thing to remember. You cannot form a quality satin stitch that has less width than the diameter of the needle that you are using. It's physically impossible for the stitch width to be smaller than the width of the needle. And
So
we're
right.
going to get into that.
So we're talking about the thread, we're talking about the needle, we're talking about all of that. They've got to align to get this just right. So let's look at the
Exactly.
thread. Let's start with the thread.
So, talking about thread, may not be the most exciting thing in the world. but we primarily use 3 different weights of thread in embroidery. We use 40 weights, 60 weights, and it's either 75 or 80, depending on who the manufacturer might be. The
Right.
smaller the smaller the number, the thicker the thread. The higher the number, the thinner the thread. You
Talk
can
about trying to confuse people. So the smaller
exactly.
the smaller the number, the thinner. Did you say the thicker?
Nope.
See,
The
confused.
smaller the number, the thicker the text.
Right.
The bigger the number, the thinner the text.
Oh
Or
my
the
word.
thread. I'm sorry, the thread.
No, all right. So people pay attention to this. Make sure you get it right.
So a 40 weight thread is thicker than a 60 weight thread, and a 60 weight thread is thicker than a 75 or 80 weight thread. Now, that's really important when you're forming small stitches, because you can use the same number of stitches to form a smaller letter with a thicker thread. And so you don't have to pack as many stitches into a small space using smaller thread. However, and here's what's super duper critical, okay? And anybody who tells you that you can use a thinner thread without using a smaller or thinner needle is not doing you a service. If you are going to ask your digitizer, or if you are doing the digitizing yourself and you intend to use a thinner weight thread, you must put a thinner needle on your machine, or you are completely defeating the purpose of the techniques used for creating smaller text.
Right. So mitigation factor number one, we're looking at the size of the needle. So I'm starting with the needle itself. That's the number one thing. And then we look at the thread, if that makes any sense.
Yes. Well, they're married forever. Okay. You do not want to divorce your threads and your needles, or you will have orphan children who didn't behave properly.
Right, brilliant. So we do not want to have orphan children when we're digitizing. All right, so we look
So
at the needle.
typically, let me just
Go ahead.
throw in, typically on most embroidery machines that I walk into, or the production floors that I walk onto, decorators are using a 7511 sharp point needle most of the time. Okay, it's a very generic, great to use needle most of the time. However, if you're going to do small text with the intention of using thin thread, you want to switch to something like a 65-9 needle or a 70-10 needle. Either one of those would be appropriate. Okay. You might also, depending on the fabric that you're going to be stitching on, use a ballpoint needle as opposed to a sharp point needle. Now, some people will ask.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the type of fabrics that match which needle then?
Sure. We're going to talk about materials a little bit more here in a second, but a sharp point needle. Okay, let me say the difference between a ballpoint needle and a sharp point needle. A ballpoint needle is designed to actually penetrate between the fabric. Okay, and so a sharp point needle can actually cut. So if you're using fine woven fabrics, you want to use a sharp point needle. If you're using knit fabrics, you want to use a ballpoint needle. Okay, now the difference between ballpoint and sharp point is not as critical as the size of the needle. I'm just kind of throwing that in there as an expert tip. Okay,
Good.
For instance, if you are stitching on caps, okay, you almost always want to use a sharp point needle. Okay, and if you're going to be stitching small text on caps, then you're going to want to use, the thinner needle with a sharp point. Okay, so moving forward, we'll talk about some of the things to consider for, small lettering as far as fabric, as far as your fabric substrate stuff.
Let's look at that. Yes, let's look at that. The fabric, the types of different fabrics that go along. So you mentioned just now the ballpoint would be more applicable for, let's say, a beanie, whereas you want to have a sharp needle for a hat. Let's talk about
Correct.
all types of fabrics.
Basically, if your fabric is knitted, you want to use a ballpoint if you can. If your fabric is woven, or if it's a tough fabric, say like a Carhartt jacket, okay, you're going to
Yeah.
want to most likely use a knit. I'm sorry, a sharp point needle. So fabric weight considerations is super duper important. It's beyond the scope of this webinar to talk about every single type of fabric that's out there. However, everybody who's watching this webinar is probably familiar with, different fabrics. You have your performance knits, which are super duper popular right now. You have your good old fashioned traditional piqué knits. You have your fleece sweatshirts, your woven and broadcloth shirts. Each one of these is going to perform differently on small text than it would if you were just doing a typical logo with, let's just say, not small text, okay? And you need to tell your digitizer.
Can you give us sort of more concrete example between, say, the piqué polo versus a lycra?
Okay, so the piqué polo, I don't have a graphic that will show this. I apologize for that. A piqué knit polo used to be called a waffle weave. Okay, and we all know what waffles look like, right? They have all the multitude of rows of squares, right? So what happens when you're stitching on a piqué knit is the stitches will fall into that waffle pattern, and it causes the letters to look distorted, or sometimes the letters will look unfinished, or they will have what I like to call a sawtooth edge to them. So if you look at the letters closely, they look like the edge of a saw blade, rather
Right.
than a nice straight line. So what happens is you can take a logo, stitch it on a piqué knit polo, and maybe it doesn't look that good. Then you take that exact same logo and you make absolutely no changes to it whatsoever, other than that you stitch it on a broadcloth shirt, and it looks beautiful. Okay, and the difference is the fabric substrate. Now, a broadcloth or a linen shirt, they have no stretch. They don't have that woven texture to them. So the
Right.
letters just stand up loud and proud on that fabric. And they look very nice.
As
So,
opposed to the lycra, for example.
so lycra is the nightmare of all embroidery fabrics. And I'd be willing to bet that a lot of people out here, that are watching the webinar have experienced this. I like to, when I'm joking around, I'll say that stitching on performance knit or lycra or spandex is kind of like embroidering on a rubber band. Okay. The
Steve,
fabric,
forgive me. Is it possible for you to go into full screen? I was being asked by a member of our audience if we could
I
get.
should be in full screen, I believe.
I can see it properly, but if we can zoom in any further, that would be great. I think what we're seeing is the presentation mode.
I shouldn't be presentation mode. If it should be, can you see the tools that I'm using to click through slides?
Yes, we can.
Oh, we should not be seeing that. Oh, son of a gun. 1 second, please.
Yeah, that's all right.
Is that better?
Much better. If you zoom back in, yeah, now we can see that much better. There you go, Mark. Thank you very much for your input. That's very much appreciated.
So you can't see the
Yeah, it's
webinar.
perfect now. It's absolutely perfect now. I
Okay.
was seeing everything, so I didn't really notice it. My
Guys,
apologies.
I'm sorry. I thought this is what we were on. I apologize.
Right,
Okay.
so we are back to, yeah, there you go.
Okay. So, as I was saying, small letters on, oh, goodness gracious.
We're back to Lycra, the nightmare.
Yeah, right. So lycra is the nightmare fabric of all embroidery substrates. And the reason for that is because it stretches in all directions, and it's like embroidering on a rubber band. If you intend on stitching small text on a performance knit, a lycra, or a spandex product, you absolutely positively must tell your digitizer that that's what you're going to be stitching on, okay? Excuse me. And there's a very good chance that the file that I or anybody else creates for you will only be appropriate for use on that product. And if you're going to use that same design on different products, you are going to need a different version of the design to get satisfactory results.
So
Now,
that's very important to
right,
emphasize that Lycra then will be file specific. Once you've done it for that fabric, that's it. It works for that only.
For the most part, yes. I always hate to say definitively for anything because sometimes you'll put a design on a product and you'll get very lucky and it'll just work. However, I'm just here to warn you that that's not always the case. And I want to try to avoid getting too deep into the weeds with all the technical details. And we can save some of that for questions at the end, and I can give people tips and tricks for specifics, to how to, possibly mitigate specific quality issues at the embroidery. What I'm trying to provide now is a broad explanation of the differences between the fabrics. For example, you can digitize a design for piqué knit polo with small text that will probably work okay for fleece, like a sweatshirt or a hoodie, and it will probably work well on a woven or a broadcloth. But that same design is probably not going to work well on a lycra or spandex. Conversely, if I program something for you for lycra spandex and you try to put it on a piqué knit polo or a fleece sweatshirt, it's just not going to perform well.
Got it. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about lettering, I believe.
Okay, so we are going to get into some details because when you have a conversation with your digitizer, you want to understand where they're coming from, okay? And we want you to understand why things might look differently to you on a screen or why they might look differently to you in a sew out, especially if you're doing something like stitching out a sample on an embroidery backing, like a Pellon backing. If you do that before you go directly to a real product, you might see the density issues poking out at you.
Right.
When we digitize for small text, we reduce the density in the design because if you try and pack too many stitches into too small of a space, then the lettering really starts to look bad. Density is defined as the amount of space between stitches, okay? So if you look at the graphic on the left side of the screen, the amount of space that's between the points on the left and right side is density. The closer those points are together, the more dense those letters will look. So if you look at the image on the right, the bottom word digitizing has the least amount of density, and the top lettering has the most amount of density. Those are all the exact same letter with only one change, and that's the amount of density that's in the text. Now, why is this important? Let's say that QDigitizing or any other digitizer creates a design for you with small lettering, and you're putting it on a piece of apparel. And you get a result that looks like one of the three things on the side. Well, you probably desire the top, but if it looks like the bottom, you'd be very unhappy. Yeah, you need to tell your digitizer, please add density, to the letters, okay? Because here, doing what we do, we use general settings because we believe that this has worked on many other products in the past, so this is what we're going to use as a stepping off point to do the digitizing. You might get it in your production facility and you're sampling on a different material that's going to give different results, and you get something that looks like the bottom or the middle. You need to let us know, or if you are making the edits yourself, or if you are digitizing this yourself, you need to add more density.
Brilliant. So density. Shall we move on, Steve?
Yes.
We're already halfway through or webinar for today. So we're going to look at serifs. Perhaps you want to talk a little bit about the differences between a sans serif and the different serif fonts and what works best for these
Okay,
small texts.
so probably aside from using the proper needles and the proper threads, even more so, the most important thing that you need to consider when you're talking about doing small text is the font that you're going to be using.
So
You know,
Times Numeral, for example, one of my favorite.
Times New Roman, though, is a terrible font for small text embroidery. It's the worst, okay? The reason for that being is all of the stitches that we are packing in to make those serifs on small text, embroidery simply does not have the resolution to do that well. You can use the finest threads in the world, you can use the skinniest needles in the world. All you're going to do is reduce the challenges that you're going to have. If you can, whenever possible, when considering small text, as defined as text smaller than a quarter inch tall or 4 millimeters tall, you want to simplify and use a sans serif font if possible. We understand at QDigitizing that sometimes people are going to insist that we use their font, and in those cases, we're always going to reach out and advise a customer, these are the challenges that you're going to see using the serif font at this size. Can we make this change? If not, then the quality may suffer with the finished product. It's not that QDigitizing is not good at what we do. And if you're digitizing yourself, it's not that you're not good at what you do. There are limitations to the medium. And what any good digitizer is going to do is, provide advice and guidance for which fonts are going to work best in a small size.
Steve, can we go back a little bit, and can you kindly define what a serif is? I had a question popping up here already asking if we could focus on that.
Sure. A serif, so looking at the screen that we have on right now, on the bottom row of letters, the A, B, C, okay, I call them the feet. If you look at the A, you'll notice how there is a row of horizontal stitches on the left and right side of the A. Some people call that a foot, like the A has 2 feet on it, kind of supporting the letter. That is a serif, okay? If you look at the A directly on top of it, that is sans serif, sans meaning none. So sans serif means no serif, serif means with a serif. If you look at the letter B on both sides, you see the 2 stitches on either end at the top and the bottom of the B. Those are the serifs. Those actually have literally 2 stitches, okay? So when your letter is at 4 millimeters tall, those 2 stitches are like nothing. They're so small that you can't see them, and
Right.
all you're doing is kind of asking for trouble, because your machine can only move so much, or such a small teeny weeny increment, and you have that needle issue again. On the letter C, on the top part of the C, you'll notice that there's kind of a little hat on the right side of the top. That's a serif. If you look at the top C, there are no serifs.
So we're saying we prefer no serifs.
Whenever possible, with small text, we're always going to recommend to reduce the serifs. Okay.
Brilliant. Brilliant. That's a great question. And thank you very much for your input, Mark, once again. Let's move forward. Steve, shall we now?
Okay. So some fonts are just not well suited to small text, period. Okay. And here we have ABC in a sans serif font. And then immediately below, we have ABC in an Old English font. Okay. I'm here to tell you that Old English will never work as a small font. If you're asking your digitizer to do that, and they come back and tell you, I'm sorry, that's not going to work well at this size, and you say do it anyway, you do that at your own risk. It's just not going to stitch well at a small size.
Right then,
So,
brilliant. Good to know. So it's all of it's the fonts absolutely very important.
and I'm just going to throw this out here, some additional considerations for fonts. Okay. And remember, folks, we're talking about small text. We're not talking about big text. Okay. Very, very few script text, cursive, whatever you want to call it, work well as small text. Okay. They just don't work. And the reason being is the centers of the letters will fill in, because if the hole is so small on the middles of letters like E's and A's and P's and Q's and D's, they
It will
just
just
fill
fill
in.
in.
They just fill in and they don't look good. Two color letters never work as small text, especially, and double, triple especially, if you want a satin stitch border on small text. It's just, to use common vernacular, it just ain't gonna work. Okay.
Right. Brilliant, brilliant. We shall keep that one in mind. Right. So those are the additional font considerations.
No
Right.
two color small fonts. Okay. I mean, you can sometimes cheat and do a walk stitch border, but I'm here to tell you, of all the quality concerns that we hear about with QDigitizing, my goodness, a very high majority of them are people who don't like the way that walk stitch borders look on small text. And a lot of times customers, and by customers, I mean the end user. I don't necessarily mean the person that I work directly with. So that might be the customer's customer. Okay. They don't like, if you put a walk stitch border on small text, they're like, I don't like the way that dotted line looks going around my text. I'm like, well, a satin stitch border is not an option. So they either kind of have to learn to like it, or we need to delete it and go with no second color.
All right. Brilliant. So
okay.
Steve, we are coming to a close and we're going to move into Q&A very, very soon. So let's look at the different types of tension, underlay, hooping, and all the good stuff.
Okay, so we'll just run into these real quick because this can get very technical very fast. However, if you look at the word happy birthday that is below the thread tension test, all the white that you see that's like on the edge of the letters or like going across, that is because the tension on the machine is messed up. Okay, all those letters are actually digitized consistently, but the problem is the tension is so bad that no matter how well those letters are digitized, they will not stitch well unless you fix the tension on your machine, period. Okay, now good tension is always important in embroidery. You can't have good embroidery without good tension on your machine. However, that is times 10 for small letters. Okay,
Times
so a lot of
10
times
for small letters.
So a lot of times people will, voice concerns that their text doesn't look good. And oftentimes myself or my assistant Flora, who answers the phones a lot, will say, can you please send us a picture of your embroidery, how it came off your machine, and please do us a favor and show us the back side of the embroidery, because we want to see how your tensions look on the machine. Because if the tensions are really out of whack, there's nothing that we can do, excuse me, in the digitizing to fix it for you. We have to have a discussion about tension. Okay, so the three pictures that are on the left show three different tensions that can come off your machine. Okay, your tensions can either be, it's like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. It can either be too tight, too loose, or just right. Okay, so your middle view is perfect. Okay, actually, I'm sorry. The one on the right is just right. We have 1/3 of the top color, then a stripe of bobbin thread, then another third of your top color. That's perfect tension. Couldn't be better. Here's where it gets tricky, folks. On small text, it's sometimes hard to see those three bands, but I'm here to tell you, if it looks like the one on the far left, your tensions need to be adjusted. Okay. As far as bobbin thread coming up on the top, your tension is almost always going to be too tight on top, and that pulls the bobbin thread from the back side of the embroidery to the top side of the embroidery. And since the tension is so tight, it distorts the heck out of the thread. Okay.
All right, Steve, what about, we've got to crack on. What about the underlay?
Okay, so underlay on small text, you need to tell your, any good digitizer is going to use a center walk underlay 90% of the time. If you want something else, okay, you need to let your digitizer know. To me, edge run underlay on small text is public enemy number one, and I would never ever use it on letters that are 0.25. So if you're doing your own digitizing out there, folks, avoid an edge run underlay like the plague for small text. Zigzag underlays, if they're done properly with good tensions, can be effective, but again, you're putting too many stitches in too small of a place. So you can run into issues. Tatami underlays are typically not used for small text. They're just not used.
Right.
So
moving forward, Steve, and hooping. And by the way, people, you can start putting in your questions into the chat, and I'll read them out to Steve in a few moments.
Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about today, and I'm only going to go over this super duper quickly, folks, and you can actually find some resources on our website, QDigitizing.com, and then click on the link for the blog, and then type in performance knit. And what that's going to show you is a technique for hooping for performance knits and embroidering small text. Okay, it's too much for me to just pop it on the screen here right now. But the most important thing to remember, especially when stitching performance knits, is don't hoop your material too tight. What happens if it needs to be tight enough so it secures the fabric, but if it's overly tight, it makes it like a drum head. And when you release that hoop, then all that fabric that was stretched really tight releases and everything will pucker, and it does what I call potato chipping. So if you can imagine what one potato chip looks like if you put it on your table, that's what can happen if you hoop too tight. One other thing, typically you're not going to want to use tearaway backings when stitching small text. You're going to want to use a good quality cutaway backing, and make sure that you do not commit the cardinal sin of not hooping a full piece of backing. Your backing should cover the entire hoop. If you put like just a strip of backing across the middle and think that's good enough, that is the cardinal sin of hooping. Your backing must cover the entire hoop.
Well, we would not want to commit a cardinal sin, Steve. And now that we've come to an end, I've got some questions coming in already for you. So we've got Jason. Jason Trout, he said, when you mentioned the needle used for hats, did you say a sharp point thinner needle?
Well, if you're going to be doing the small text, yes, a sharp point with like a 10 needle, or yes, like a 6510 versus a 7511 sharp point for caps. Now, there are some caps, though, that you might want to use a ballpoint. And, you know, some of the caps that have like a silky fabric on top, like that old athletic material where it kind of has like those little holes all over it. The thing is there's no one rule that works all the time. Sometimes I like to, when people will let me have the conversation, I like to say I live in a world of uncertainties. Okay. And even
Right.
after doing this for 30 plus years, and folks, I'm not trying to brag, but when I say millions upon millions of pieces of apparel, I still learn things, new things almost every single day. And I will apply different techniques for different fabrics to get the best quality embroidery.
Okay, Steve, Ray Tan is asking, are you referring to the bottom tension or active feed setting on the Melker
Oh,
machine?
that is an excellent question, and thank you very much for asking it. Okay, so Melco embroidery machines have active feed, which is an auto tensioning system. Okay, to get the best results possible, you need to be constantly adjusting for a specific design at a specific time. So the way that active feed works is it looks at a design and it looks at the stitches that are coming up in the design, and it decides how much thread it wants to feed into the needle in order to do what's being requested of it. If your settings are not correct for the digitizing that's been done for you and for the fabric that you're going to be using, you can be feeding too much or too little thread into the needle. Melco machines, they're like some of the best machines in the whole wide world, but they're a little bit different in one respect than some of the older school machines that were out there, in that to get the absolute best performance out of those machines, it's kind of like a high performance sports car. You need to tune it according to exactly what you're going to be doing.
Right.
And, Melco has some really good webinars and content online for how to adjust for that. And since you've asked the question, let me just kind of highlight it this way. Your active feed settings for doing puff embroidery are significantly different than the active feed settings for doing small text with no puff. And if you're trying to use the same settings, you are not going to get superior results. Will your machine stop working? Absolutely not. However, you won't get the best results possible.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ray, for your question, and Steve for the answer. We go to Laura Moore. She's asking, do you have any tips for using a font that looks like handwriting in a 4mm size to help it look neat and readable?
That's a tricky one, and that goes all the way back to this slide right here. Okay. The problem with I know the font that you're talking about, and there's several versions of it. Embroidery, the resolution is such that you can't get away with those subtle little, hooks and crooks and crannies, that might make up a handwriting type font. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but what you're going to want to use is, back to the start of the slide, you're going to want to use the 60-weight thread. You're going to want to tell your digitizer that you're going to be using 60-weight thread, and you're going to want to use a small needle. Depending on your fabric substrate, you need to consider what backings you're going to use. I would suggest nothing less than a 3-ounce cutaway backing, and you might want to consider using a spray adhesive when you apply the backing to the product. So what I suggest is you can take a fabric spray like a KK100, okay, and you can lightly spray a 3-ounce cutaway backing and apply that to the product first. Then, so actually what you do is you turn, let's say it's a shirt, you turn the shirt inside out, lightly spray your backing with a KK100, and then apply the backing directly to the product, and then hoop as normal, okay? Making sure that you hoop all of the backing. What that does is it applies additional stability to the fabric, and it allows the substrate to stretch as little as possible. So when you are stitching, the fabric is moving around less, and will allow you to get more crisp letters. But again, the one key there, though, is if you're doing it yourself using stock lettering, just make sure that you're adjusting your densities and don't use anything other than a center walk underlay for sure on that font.
Thank you very much, Steve. Laura, I hope we answered your question. We're going to move now to Anthony Weedman. I hope I got that right. The question is, are magnet hoops not good for performance materials? For example, polos.
So I just want to say, we've done several webinars now That is perhaps one of the best questions I've received yet. And it's actually a very inspired question. Okay. So Magna hoops are great for what they're great for. There are some things I'm not a big fan of them. And one of them is certainly performance knits. And the reason for it is they don't hold the fabric firmly. Okay. Now you can mitigate that some by using a technique similar to what I just described and using a very good quality backing and use, like I said, a KK100. By the way, folks, there are backings you can buy nowadays that already have a light sticky back on them. If you're going to use a magnet hoop rather than a round hoop or a pressure hoop, okay, then you're going to want to make sure that you very well stabilize that material. I hope that answers that question. That's a tricky one. That's actually a really tricky one.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, Anthony. We hope we did our best. We did try. We're going now to Xavier Tyus. The question is it better to use thinner thread when doing small fonts? Is it better to use thinner threads when doing small fonts?
The short answer to that question is yes. The long answer is so long as you're using the appropriate needle and you're letting your digitizer know that that is your intent. Or again, if you're doing the digitizing yourself or if you're using stock lettering, you need to use the other techniques that are appropriate. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. Okay. I hope I didn't overcomplicate my answer.
Well, you said short answer is yes.
Yes, but the long answer is you have to use the other techniques or using the thinner thread won't matter.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much, Xavier. I hope we answered your question well enough. Laura Gamble, what is the highest density I can use for texts that are 1/4 inch? For example, the increment in pulse in SPI.
So SPI is stitches per inch. Okay. So, back in the old days, I would say my default setting would be 60 stitches per inch. Okay. So, I mean, it so depends on the fabric, but I would say you never really want to have more than 55 stitches to an inch or more than 65 stitches to an inch when you're working with small text. But it so very much depends on the fabric and the font. If we're trying to do a serif font like a Times New Roman, we might go with the lower density than a higher density. Okay. And it totally, this one falls clearly in the world of, if I'm personally doing the embroidery myself, I might start at a setting that I think is going to work and then adjust accordingly based on what I'm finding in the real world. Guys, I know that's a pain in the rear end. Believe me, I know. But as I said a little while ago, I live in a world of uncertainties and I adjust according to what is presented to me.
Splendid. Thank you very much, Laura. Again, I hope we answered your question well enough. Next question is from Betty Weimer. I got interrupted and did not get the answer. So do we have access to the video after today? Sorry, I probably, that was an easy question probably for me. But Betty, I can answer that question for you. You will receive a link to download the video, and you can go onto our YouTube channel and watch not just this video, but previous webinars as well. We shall move on to our anonymous attendee. If we need a logo digitized in a thinner thread like 60's thread of Madeira, do we need to inform you as our digitizer about that?
100%, absolutely, positively, yes.
Right, brilliant. Mr. Anonymous or Miss Anonymous, I hope that answers your question. 100% yes. Let's see, this is another question from Betty Weimer. Can we, sorry, let me see what she wrote there properly. Can we have a recommendation, I suppose you wanted to write, on where to get 60 weight threads?
So in the US, Madeira and Robus and Anton and good old Stigma all are very, very high quality threads, and I wouldn't recommend anything other than those. There are other options out there, but for me, it's kind of like, why bother? So Madeira, Robus and Anton, and Gunold are really three high quality choices with, literally hundreds of colors. However, I forgot to mention earlier in the webinar, one of the downsides to thinner weight threads is there's less than half of the colors available for thin threads than there are for the traditional 40 weight embroidery thread. So you just can't go as crazy with the number of colors, that are available to you. And just so you know, the thinner the thread, the fewer the color choices. There's a definite correlation there.
Okay, fantastic. And our final question as we wrap up today from Sam Fewer, I believe that's the pronunciation. My apologies, Sam, I did give it a go. Is there a special consideration for the type of bobbin thread used for small font lettering?
Wow, you guys. That's a great question. I'm going to answer that. I'm just a gigantic fan of the Magna bobbins that are out there. They are so good at preventing or helping to prevent bobbin backlash. And boy, guys, that's almost a webinar for an entirely different day. But let me answer this question this way. You don't want to use cotton bobbins. Okay, make sure you're using a polyester bobbin whenever possible. The reason you don't want to use cotton bobbins is they're very linty. And what happens is you get little balls of lint that will form underneath the bobbin tension spring. And once that happens, your tensions can go all over the place. What is far more important for your bobbin tension is there's that little spring that's on the side of your bobbin case. I wish I had one here to show you right now, but I don't. But that little spring that's on the side of your bobbin case that controls the tension of the bobbin, underneath that spring, you can get little balls of thread. I call them pills. And if you get a pill underneath there, what happens is the bobbin spring lifts up a little bit, and then the tension, you're no longer able to keep the tension consistent on that bobbin case. Never, ever, 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 ever use like a needle to get a little piece of lint out from underneath that string. From underneath that spring. If you do that, you're going to destroy that spring. And at that point, just throw it in the garbage. Okay. Sometimes you can use like maybe a piece of dental floss, or you can use a business card, just something flat to go underneath that spring and clean out any lint that might be underneath that spring that's causing your tension to get messed up. Now, this just comes into the Steve's world of if I could be king for a day and everything were perfect. I personally throw out
English to be a king, Steve. Sorry.
I throw those bobbins out. When that spring gets sprung, I throw them out. And the reason being is, a bobbin case might cost $8 to $10 to replace completely. Or you can buy a replacement spring that you'll go insane trying to screw it back on with the microscopic screws that are required. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's very difficult to change that spring out. So if you're going to measure if time is money, it's going to cost you more in time to replace those springs than just to toss the bobbin case and replace it with a new one. That is purely Steve's opinion. No science behind that other than 30 years of embroidery experience.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. Sam, I hope we answered your questions in a satisfactory manner. And we are once again drawing to a close. Thank you very much, Steve, for your time and your expertise. Thank you very much to all our audience and our attendees today, and we look forward to the next webinar. As mentioned, you will be receiving an email with a link So you can go to our YouTube channel and you'll be able to have you'll be able to review and watch this webinar and others that we have done before. Thank you very much and have a fantastic day, Steve. And to
All
everyone
right,
else.
thanks. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.